B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Eirovin Daf Kuf Aleph. We're going to start from the Mishnah right at the top of the Omid. Says the Mishnah, Hadeles shebamuktzah. And in this Mishnah we're going to learn about boine, building. One's not allowed to build on Shabbos. It's one of the lamates melachas. And one of the forms of building is extending to an existing wall and closing up an existing wall, an opening in a wall. And with every door, we have to consider, why is it not called boine? You're closing a door and you're, so to speak, making an extension to an existing wall. Why is there no issue with boine? Obviously, if it's not there to be fixed, it's not there to be permanent, it's a door that opens and closes all the time, especially when it's clear, when it's discernible, where nobody would leave a door in that position permanently, then it's not called boine. But there are certain types of doors where they are either more permanent or they look more permanent. It's not clear to the eye that it's actually not an extension, and then there could be boine, either on a biblical level or on a rabbinical level. So the Mishnah discusses Hadeles shebamuktzah. A muktzah is a backyard, typically a place that a person does not use it for residential purposes that often, and he doesn't mind putting a doorway there that's not your typical doorway. So this doorway in the backyard, or v'chadokim shebapirtza, if you're using thorns to block up a gap in a wall, umachzolis, or if you're using reed mats to close up an opening, ein noyalin behen elo imkein gavoim min haaretz. You're only allowed to close an opening with these things only providing that they are lifted off the ground, they're not dragging along the ground. And if they're in the doorway and they're not on the ground, then it's clear to everybody that this is not a permanent closure, it's not considered boine, and one can close them on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, or a minu, we're going to ask a contradiction from a brisa. Deles hanigreres, if you have a door that is dragging on the floor, umachzeles hanigreres, or if you've got a reed mat which is dragging on the floor, v'kankan hanigrar, the kankan is a plow handle that is also being used to close an opening, to close a gap, and it's dragging on the floor. Bisman shekshurim utluyim, if they are tied to the existing wall, and they are tluyim, which means they are suspended, in that case, ne'elin ben b'Shabbos, since they're also tied and also suspended, that means they're not dragging. That means they are dragging, but they are held from the wall. Then in that case, one's allowed to lock them. You're allowed to put these things, this deles, the machzeles, or the kankan, into the doorway, and it's not considered boine. You can do it on Shabbos. It goes without saying you can do it on Yom Tov. So in this brisa you see clearly that it's enough that it's kshurim utluyim, that it's hung and held onto the wall, and then you can close it. The very virtue of the fact that it's attached to the wall beforehand, then you can see that this is not just simply blocking up the gap permanently, and it's okay. But in this brisa, it doesn't say the condition that it has to be gavoyin min haaretz, it has to be raised up off the ground. Omar Abaya answers, b'sheyesh lohem tzir. It's talking about that this doorway has a pivot, a type of a hinge, and since it's got this tzir, therefore everybody can see that it's a door that's going to be opened and closed and is not going to be used as a permanent fixture in the wall, and therefore it's okay. Sabai actually explains that the brisa means that there's always one of two options. Either it's elevated off the ground, and then you do not need, either it's elevated off the ground, and if it's not elevated off the ground, at least it's got to have a tzir, a pivot, a hinge, and then that's also enough to make it clear and it's recognizable that it's a door. Rava Omar, Rava says, tzir, even if it doesn't have a pivot at this point in time, but if it had a pivot, then you can see that this type of closure is a door, it's not a permanent fixture to close the gap, then that suffices, and it does not need to be lifted off the ground. Asks the Gemara Meisvei, Deles hanigreres, if you have a door that's dragging along on the floor, machzeles hanigreres, v'kankan hanigrar, bisman shekshurim utluyim ugavoyim min haaretz, afilu kameloinima, that if it's hung and it's raised off the ground, even just a little bit, a hair's breadth off the ground, noelin behem, you can close them, vim lav ein noelin behem. So you see clearly here that the doorway has to be elevated off the ground, not like it says in the brisa that it's enough to be kshurim utluim. And the truth is, it's very difficult to understand what the Gemara means to ask. This brisa is exactly what it says in our Mishnah, that it's got to be gavoyim min aretz. And Abaye and Rava just explained that it needs to be gavoyim when it doesn't have, or it never had, a pivot. And that's actually what's going to be the answer of the Gemara. The question is, what was the question of the Gemara? But this is how Rashi learns that it's just it's the same question again. And the same answers, other Rishonim actually have an extra few words in the brisa. But either way, this is how Rashi learns. So Abaye metaretz l'tamei, Rava metaretz l'tamei. Abaye can answer the contradiction with his opinion, and Rava with his. Abaye metaretz l'tamei, oy sheyesh lohen tzir, oy shekvoy min aretz. As we said before, you would always need any one of two conditions, besides the fact that it's tied to the wall. Either it's raised off the ground, or it's got a pivot. Rava metaretz l'tamei. And Rava answers, either it's raised off the ground, or it once had a pivot. Of course, if it's got a pivot now, but even if it doesn't have a pivot now, if it had one, you have enough of a simon, a heker, it's recognizable that it's a door, and therefore you're allowed to close the doorway, the gap, with this door. Exactly the way Abaye and Rava explained our Mishnah with the first brisa, that's how they explained the second brisa. Continues the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon. Suchei koitzin, branches of thorn bushes, v'chavilin, and bundles, shehiskinon lepirtza shebechotza. They were prepared to close a gap in the wall of a courtyard. Bizman shekshurim utluin, providing that they are tied and suspended from the wall. Ne'elin ben b'Shabbos, you're allowed to close the gap with these suchei koitzin v'chavilim on Shabbos. Ve'in tzarich leima b'yontav, it goes without saying that you can do it on Yom Tov. Continues the Gemara. Tani Reb Chia. Reb Chia taught the following brisa. Deles almona, a widowed door. Which means the same as a widow, there's something missing in her life, namely her husband. This door, we'll soon see what it is, but there's something not regular, there's something missing about this door. And since it's not your regular door, it looks similar to a building rather than a regular closure with a door. So this deles almona hanigreres, which is dragging on the ground, it's not lifted off the ground at all. Ein noelin bo, you're not allowed to close a doorway, a gap with it. Heichadomi deles almona. What is a deles almona, a widowed door? That you're not allowed to use it to close a doorway if it's not raised off the ground. Ike de omra de chad shifa. Some explain if it's a door with a single board. Typical doors are made with two boards that were attached together. If it's just a single board, it looks like you're boarding up the wall. That looks like boine. So if it's not, if it's nigreres, if it's dragging along the floor, you're not allowed to close with it on Shabbos. Ve'ikadamra, others say, delesle gishmo, there was a cross beam that used to be attached to the door, and to the door frame, and this crossbeam was missing, and therefore it didn't look like a door, and therefore it was closer and more similar to just boarding up a gap, an opening in a wall, and that would be also on Shabbos, and therefore in this case it's also to close the door with these things, with these doors on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. Omer of Yehuda. Hai madurta mimalo lemata shori. You've got this bonfire. And again, this is a Gemara that's discussing what looks like boina. Doing something that looks like you're building is also on Shabbos, even if it's not permanent and even if it's not really building. The Chachamim didn't allow it. If you have this bonfire, that regularly the way they would make this fire is they would make a structure. They would first have some woods that are arranged on a lower level, and then they would put some more beams on a higher level, and that's how they would build it. You're not allowed to do it that way on Shabbos, on Yom Tov actually. On Shabbos you're not allowed to do it at all. You're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbos. On Yom Tov you're allowed to light a fire, but you're not allowed to build. So we're talking here about Yom Tov. So mimalo lemato shori, you have to first hold and suspend the upper part of the bonfire and place underneath it the lower part. That's not a normal way of building. Since it doesn't look like building when you're setting it up, you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Mimato lemalo, but to build it up in the way one would normally build up any building, starting at the base and moving up, Also, you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. V'chein be'asa, the same as with an egg. And there's discussion exactly what the case is, but when you're putting an egg over on some woods or arranging some eggs, you should first put the eggs in position and hold them with your hands, and then put the frame underneath the eggs and not build it up. First the frame and then the eggs on top. V'chein kidra, the same as with a pot. If you want to suspend a pot on some barrels, first hold the pot and then put the barrels underneath it. V'chein puria, and the same as with a collapsible bed, that the part of the bed that we would call the mattress, or what's holding the mattress, was a piece of skin that was tied to the frame, and when they would want to use it, they would tie this piece of leather to the frame, and when they were finished, they wanted to collapse it, they just detached it from the legs, from the frame, and that's how they dismantled the bed. So if you want to do this on Shabbos, you have to first hold this piece of leather and then put the frame round it and attach it, and not the other way around. V'chein chavita, and the same as with barrels. You want to make a pile of barrels, you first hold up the barrels you want on top, and then you put the lower ones underneath it, so it should not look like boineh. Continues the Gemara. Omalei hahu tziduki. The tziduki were the heretics, the koifrim, that they used to often challenge the Chachmei Yisrael, and they didn't believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Klal Yisrael had an issue with them. And this Tziduki, he challenged, or he said, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, all over Shas we find, in the time of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, he was the one that would challenge the Tzidukim. So this Tziduki said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, Chidko, he said to him, you thorny one, Tichsiv b'chu, about you, it says in the Pasuk, there's a Pasuk in Micha, it says, Toivom kechedek, which means that the best of you are like thorns. Omar le, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya said back to this Tziduki, Shatya, fool, Shfil l'sefer dikra, go down to the end of the pasuk, keep reading the pasuk. You think this pasuk is a degrading comment? No, you're going to see it's one of value, it's one of honor. Tichsiv, it says the next words in the pasuk, Yoshar mimasuka, that the upright, that means the upright of Klal Yisrael are more upright than the shelters, than that what protects us. So you see this pasuk is talking about the virtues and values of Klal Yisrael, not about the fact that the best of Klal Yisrael are thorns. Ve'elomai toivom kechedek. What does it mean that the toivom, the best of them, are like thorns? Kashem shechadokim alolu, in the same way as these thorns, meginim ala pirza, they protect from the gaps in the walls, which means that they are used to fill up the gaps, to prevent outside influences coming in. Kach toivim shebonu, so too the best amongst us, meginim oleinu, they protect us from outside influences. Davar achir, another explanation how the word toivom kachedek can actually mean something positive. It means shemahadkim es harashoim, chedek, which is a thorn, and hedek, which could mean to crush, are the similar letters, just the he and the ches are often switched. So it says toivom kachedek actually means toivom are engaged in hedek, in crushing. Who do the best of us crush? The Rashoim. Shemahadkim es harashoim legehenim. They crush the Rashoim in and to Gehenim. Shenemer, as it says in the pasuk, a few psukim later in the same parak in Micha, it says, Kumi v'doishi, arise and thrash, bas tzion, referring to Klal Yisrael, ki karneich, because your horn, osim barzel, I will make iron, uparsoisayich, and your hooves, osim nechusha, I will make them brass, v'hadikois amim rabim, and you will crush many nations. So you see that Klal Yisrael, and it's the best of Klal Yisrael, are going to be engaged in hadikois, in crushing the nations. And this is referring to crushing the Rashoim in Legehenim. And actually in the Gemara, when the Gemara says, Davar achir, toivom kachedek, shemahadkim es harashoim, this is the version that we have after the tzenzor took out and changed some words. In the original version of the Gemara, it actually is not referring to the Rashoim, it's talking about the evil nations of the world that are going to be crushed by the best of Klal Yisrael. Says the next Mishnah, Lo yamid odom b'reshus hayochid v'yiftach b'reshus harabim v'yiftach b'reshus hayochid. Here we're talking about a case where a person is standing in one domain and he's trying to open a door using a key in another domain. If he's just opening the door, there's no act of carrying there. The problem is, this key could by mistake be transferred and taken to where the person is, and then he will be moving this key from one domain to another, and in the event that it's Reshus HaRabim to Reshus HaYochid, it could be very seriously osa. So the Mishnah says, or Reb Meir in the Mishnah says, Lo Yamid Odom, and we've actually had this Reb Meir previously, a person may not stand in one domain, namely Reshus HaYochid, v'yiftach b'Reshus HaRabim, and open up a door using a key, where the door and the key is in Reshus HaRabim, because you may take the key to yourself, and then bring the key from the Reshus HaRabim to the Reshus HaYochid, or b'Reshus HaRabim v'yiftach b'Reshus HaYochid, the person shouldn't stand in a Reshus HaRabim, opening up a door with a key in a Reshus HaYochid, unless you erect a partition of 10 tvachim high around, connecting the person, the domain that he's in, and the key and the doorway all in the same Reshus HaYochid, then it's okay, because even if you pull the key to yourself, you're all in Reshus HaYochid. But all the while that the key is in one domain and the person is in the other domain, one's not allowed to be engaged in opening such a door. That's the opinion of Reb Meir. Omruloi, the Chachomim commented to Reb Meir, Maisa b'shuk shel ptomim. There was an incident in the market, the butcher's marketplace, Shahoyu b'Yerushalayim in Yerushalayim, Shahoyu noyalin, where the people themselves were standing in the Reshus HaRabim, and they used to lock the doors, or open, they used to close and lock the doors, umanichin es hamafteach b'chaloin shal gabe haPesach. They would take the key out of the doors and put them onto the window, onto the ledge above the doors. And the doorways themselves were Reshus HaYochid. They were 4 tvachim wide, 10 tvachim high. That means the locks were Reshus HaYochid. The ledge on top of the doorway was also Reshus HaYochid. The people themselves were standing in the marketplace in the Reshus HaRabim. So you see clearly that in Yerushalayim they would be standing in one domain and locking a door in the opposite domain. Obviously they were not carrying from one domain to the next, but they were engaged in locking and unlocking doors in the other domain, not like we saw from Reb Meir. Reb Yosi actually argues in one fine detail, it wasn't this incident didn't happen in the butcher's marketplace, rather in the wool merchant's marketplace, and that's what they used to do. And the Chachomim are using this story, so to speak, against Reb Meir. Asks the Gemara, V'Rabbanon, we have an issue with the Rabbanon's claim, the Omruloi, the way they responded to Reb Meir. Omer Reb Meir Reshus HaRabim. Reb Meir was talking about Reshus HaRabim. That means there was Reshus HaRabim and Reshus HaYochid. Umahadru inu Carmelis. And the Chachomim responded with an incident that happened in Yerushalayim. And even though when I learnt the Mishnah I said Reshus HaRabim, because it seems that way in the Mishnah, but it's not the truth. Yerushalayim was a Carmelis. So how can you ask a question from Carmelis where the worst case scenario, even if you draw the key to where the person is away from the doorway, he's taken the key from Reshus HaYochid into a Carmelis? That's only a rabbinical issa. How can you use that as a claim against Reb Meir, who's talking about not being able to fiddle with a key that's in the opposite domain, Reshus HaYochid and Reshus HaRabim? The Omer Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. How do I know that Yerushalayim was considered a Carmelis? The whole Yerushalayim and all the marketplaces in Yerushalayim were not considered Reshus HaRabim. Because Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said, Omer Rabbi Yechanan, Yerushalayim, regarding Yerushalayim, il molei dalso iseon in olis balaylo, if not for the gates, the doors, through in and out of Yerushalayim would have been closed at night, then Yerushalayim would be considered a Reshus HaRabim because of the volumes of people going through it. But now that Yerushalayim had these doors, and the doors were closed at night, then Yerushalayim is not a Reshus HaRabim, it's a Carmelis. So how are you Chachomim responding to Reb Meir, asking from Yerushalayim? Reb Meir wasn't talking about Carmelis, he was talking about Reshus HaRabim. Omer of Papa explains as follows. You're right, Rabbi Yechanan, that Yerushalayim is considered a Carmelis, but only before its surroundings were breached. However, our Mishnah, where the Chachomim are commenting to Reb Meir about and from Yerushalayim, we're talking about when the walls of Yerushalayim were breached open, and therefore they did have a status of Reshus HaRabim, and if nonetheless the people in Yerushalayim, in the marketplaces in Yerushalayim, would open and close doors, even though the keys are in Reshus HaYochid and they are in Reshus HaRabim, it is a claim against Reb Meir. That's how Rav Papa explained it. Rava Omar, Seifa Oson L'Sharei Gino. That you're right. The Chachomim were talking about Carmelis, and they said that it was clear from the incident in Yerushalayim. That means the Rav is arguing with Rav Papa. He's saying that you're right, that Yerushalayim is a Carmelis. And when the Chachomim commented against Reb Meir from the Yerushalayim, it was indeed they had proof that you're allowed to carry from a not carry, chas v'shalom. You're allowed to move and lock and unlock a door using a key in Reshus HaYochid, even though the person is standing in a Carmelis. You can ask me a question. Reb Meir didn't talk about that. Reb Meir never said there was an Issa about that. Reb Meir only ever said there was Osa when the people are in Reshus HaRabim proper. And there, in the event that by mistake they take the key from the Reshus HaYochid to Reshus HaRabim, it's seriously Osa. Only in that case maybe Reb Meir said it was Osa. Rav says no, we have to add a few words into the Mishnah. V'hochi ka'omar. We have to add into the Mishnah, that means the Mishnah says, Lo yamid odem Reshus HaYochid, etc. Reb Meir in the Mishnah is talking about Reshus HaYochid, Reshus HaRabim. We read into the Mishnah, V'chein lo yamid Reshus HaYochid v'yiftach b'karmelis. The same Issa applies when a person is standing in a Reshus HaYochid and he wants to open up a door using a key in a Carmelis. B'karmelis v'yiftach b'Reshus HaYochid, or if he's standing on a Carmelis and he's trying to open a door in a Reshus HaYochid. Even though over there the transfer from Reshus HaYochid to Carmelis or vice versa is only rabbinical, nonetheless it's also it's only allowed if you make an enclosure around you, that even if you were to take the key, you're not transgressing even the rabbinical prohibition of carrying from a Carmelis to Reshus HaYochid. That was the opinion of Reb Meir. And on this last detail, that the prohibition of Reb Meir is not only Reshus HaYochid, Reshus HaRabim, but even Carmelis and Reshus HaYochid, on that the Chachomim say, we've got proof from Yerushalayim, not this way. Amru loi, ma'aseh b'shuk shel ptomim, sh'hoya b'Yerushalayim, sh'hoyu noyalim u'manichem es ha'mafteach b'chaloim shel gabe ha'pesach, b'beisei b'shuk shel tzamorim hoya. That was what we saw at the end of the Mishnah. And indeed it's a Carmelis, and we're commenting against Reb Meir in the case of the Carmelis. Continues the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon. Pischei Sharei Gino. Here we're talking about that you have a Gino, which is a large open area that's not been enclosed for residential purposes. It's got the status of a Carmelis. That's a Gino. Beyond the Gino, beyond the Carmelis, you have Reshus HaRabim. But in between the Reshus HaRabim and the Carmelis, which is the Gino, you had this Pischei Sharei Gino. You had this entranceway, this little booth, or exactly what it is not so clear, whether it's a Pesach, whether it's a Shara, there's different versions here, but you had a little area in between, and this Pischei Sharei Gino itself was actually Reshus HaYochid. And that is the way that they would open and close the door. That means the doorway itself was a Reshus HaYochid. On one side of it was the Reshus HaRabim, and on the inside of it was the Carmelis. So the beginning of the Brisa is saying something very straightforward. If this entranceway, which incorporates the door itself, this little booth was on the inside, which means on the inner side of on the side of the Gino, the inside of the doorway, you can stand inside that booth and open and close the door. And then Rashi says there's no chiddush. This is simple. It's straightforward because you're standing in Reshus HaYochid and you're opening and closing a door where the key is also Reshus HaYochid. So you stand in Reshus HaYochid and you're fiddling with the key in Reshus HaYochid. Even if you were to take the key to where you're standing, it would not be aser. There's no issue with that. Mi bachutz, if this booth is on the outside, on the Reshus HaRabim side, then you can stand on the Reshus HaRabim side inside this area, this Reshus HaYochid, and you can open the door. Again, it goes without saying, it's straightforward. Mikan or mikan, if this booth or this entranceway, which is Reshus HaYochid, actually includes an area on either side of the doorway, mikan v'kan, you can open and close, you can lock this door either on the way in or on the way out from either side. There's no problem with that because it's all Reshus HaYochid. If you don't have any booth or anything that's making the person himself be standing in Rishus HaYochid, and therefore the person is either standing on the Rishus HaRabim proper on one side of the gate, of the door, or he's in the Karmelis on the other side, and he wants to open or close, he wants to lock or unlock this door with a key, then if it's loilekan, ein lem loilekan v'loilekan, if it doesn't have this base shower, which is Rishus HaYochid on either side of the doorway, asurin kan v'kan, you're not allowed to lock and unlock this door from either side, because the key itself is in the door, which we assume is Rishus HaYochid. The door's way is 4 tefachim wide, the locks were typically above 10 tefachim off the ground, and therefore the doorway is clearly Rishus HaYochid. The key is in this Rishus HaYochid, and you're standing either on the Rishus HaRabim or in the Karmelis. And according to the Brisa here, you're not allowed to lock or unlock with a key, which is in Rishus HaYochid, if you're standing either in Rishus HaRabim or in a Karmelis. That's the first part of the Brisa. Second part of the Brisa, v'chein chanuyos. Chanuyos are shops, or let's say they're shop fronts. Hapsuchois Rishus HaRabim. That means you've got Rishus HaRabim on one side. Then you've got an askupa. You've got a threshold which the Gemara is going to say has the same status, because it says v'chein chanuyos. We're comparing it to the first part of the Brisa. It has a status of a Karmelis, like the Gino had in the earlier case from the Brisa. So you had the threshold, which is just beyond the Rishus HaRabim, and beyond the threshold you had the doorway into these chanuyos, into these shops. Now, even though regarding the base shower that we saw at the beginning of the Brisa, where we took it for granted that the key, the lock, was 10 tefachim above the ground, in the case of these chanuyos, it's not always the case. Sometimes the key is below 10 tefachim off the ground, sometimes it's above 10 tefachim off the ground. The big difference being that if the key is above 10 tefachim off the ground, assuming the doorway itself is 4 tefachim wide, then the key is actually in Rishus HaYochid. If, however, it's less than 10 tefachim high, then if the doorway is 4 tefachim wide, it's only a Karmelis. If the doorway is not 4 tefachim wide, then either way it's a mokim p'tur. We're going to discuss that soon. But v'chein chanuyos, you've got these shops, hapsuchos Rishus HaRabim, and in between the Rishus HaRabim and the shops, you have the askupa, you have a threshold, which is a Karmelis, and the shops have doors that need to be locked and unlocked. Bizman shaman ulemato me'asara. In the event that the key was below 10 tefachim, which means that the key is now considered a Karmelis. In that case, maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos, you can bring the key from before Shabbos, umanichoi ba'askupa, you don't even have to put it into the door. You can leave it on the threshold. The threshold itself is a Karmelis, as the Gemara is going to say soon. Lemachor, the next day on Shabbos, piseach v'noil umachzir le'askupa. You can stand on the threshold, which is a Karmelis, take the key, open up the lock, which is less than 10 tefachim off the ground. It's also a Karmelis. Carrying from Karmelis to Karmelis is not an issue. That's if the lock is less than 10 tefachim off the ground. Ubizman shaman oil lemailo me'asara. In the event that the key is above 10 tefachim off the ground, in which case the key is in the domain considered a Rishus HaYochid, then there's a problem. Because the person is standing on the askupa, and he wants to lock and unlock the door on Shabbos, where the key is in the Rishus HaYochid. The askupa is a Karmelis, not Rishus HaYochid. So the Brisa says, maybe mafteach me'erev Shabbos, you can bring a key from before Shabbos, umanichoi b'manul, you cannot put the key on the askupa, because then you're clearly carrying it from the Karmelis into a Rishus HaYochid. You're not allowed to do that. It's also midrabanon. But you can put the key into the lock before Shabbos. Now the key is in Rishus HaYochid. Lemachor on Shabbos, poiseach v'noil umachziroi lemekoimoi. That the Brisa says you're then allowed to open, lock and unlock the key, and keep the key where it is in the lock, or put it where in the same domain as the lock. Even though the person is standing in a Karmelis, he's allowed to mess around with the key, even though the key is above 10 tefachim. And it would seem at this point that the keys are Rishus HaYochid. We're soon going to have to discuss that, because Divrei Reb Meir, that's the opinion of Reb Meir, and Is that true? That according to Reb Meir, you're allowed to stand in a caramelis and lock and unlock a door where the key is in Rishus HaYochid? It's not so clear. We saw before that not. Either way, this is the opinion of Reb Meir. The Chachamim say, even if the key is above 10 tefachim, that means the lock of the door is above 10 tefachim off the ground, Mevi mafteach me'erev Shabbos, you can bring the key on Erev Shabbos, umanichoy be'askupa, you can put the key not in the lock, you can leave the key on the threshold, which is a caramelis, and nonetheless, lemochor, the next day on Shabbos, you can lock and unlock the door and put the key back into the caramelis. You either put it back on the askupa, or you put it onto a ledge, a window ledge, on top of the door, on top of the opening. However, if the window that you're returning the key to is 4x4 tefachim, then it's different. Then also you cannot put the key there because you're taking the key from a caramelis onto Rishus HaYochid. Which means that the Chachamim here are assuming, and we'll soon see in the Gemara, but it's clear that according to the Chachamim, it must be that even though the key is above 10 tefachim, it's not got the status of Rishus HaYochid, because they wouldn't say that you can take a key from the caramelis and take it into Rishus HaYochid. Let's see the Gemara. Since the second half of the Brisa says v'chein, and similarly the shops, that we're comparing the second case to the first case, the same as the first case we're talking about the gino, which is a caramelis, so too we're talking about an askupa, the askupa of a caramelis. That means on the front of these shops there was a threshold which was a caramelis. And now the Gemara is asking, Hai man'ul heichadomi. These locks that we've just mentioned in the Brisa, in the second part of the Brisa, what are their status? If they do not have 4 tefachim wide, then mokim peturhu. Then either way, whether it's below 10 tefachim or above 10 tefachim, it has the status of a mokim petur. And to carry from a mokim petur to any rishus, we don't have an issue with that. So, mokim petur, so we don't have a problem with that. And if so, why, according to Reb Meir, does he say that you're only allowed to open and lock and unlock the door if the key was in the lock when Shabbos came in? And he says you're not unlike the Chachamim, he says you're not allowed to have the key on the askupa, on the threshold, on the caramelis, because you cannot take it from the threshold to the lock. But if the lock is a mokim petur, there's no issue with carrying from a caramelis to a mokim petur. If you say that these locks are 4x4 tefachim wide, then Baha Leimer Rabbanon, Af Bizman Shamanul Lemailo Measoro, Mevi Mafteach Me'erev Shabbos Umanichoy Ba'askupo, Lemoche Pesach V'noel Boi Machzir Le'askupo Ilachalin Shal Gabe HaPesach, V'okom Metaltal Mekarmelis L'Rishus HaYochid. And this is the big question. The Chachamim at the end of the Brisa said that even if the key is not in the doorway, even if the key is on the caramelis, then on the threshold, then he's allowed to lock and unlock this door on Shabbos. And the Chachamim say explicitly, even when it's above 10 tefachim. So if you say it's above 10 tefachim high, but it's not 4 tefachim wide, it's a mokim petur, then you can carry from the caramelis to a mokim petur. But if it's a mokim petur, we have an issue with Reb Meir. And if you say that it's not a mokim petur, you say it's a Rishus HaYochid proper, it's 4 tefachim wide, then how can the Chachamim say that you can carry from the caramelis to open the key? You can carry the key to open it up if the key, if the lock is a Rishus HaYochid. Omar Abaya says as follows: Le'olam de'ein bo arba. The truth is that according to Abaya, the lock itself is a mokim petur, and therefore we understand according to the Rabbanon, there's no issue of carrying the key from the caramelis to this mokim petur. V'yesh bo lochuk la'shlimo l'arba. However, this lock area, there's enough space there that they could etch out from the frame of this doorway, from where the lock is, they could actually carve out, potentially, and have an area of 4x4 tefachim. And that's exactly what they're arguing about. The Reb Meir says, he has such a concept of, since you could carve it out, then we virtually speaking, so to speak, as if to say we carved it out, and already now it has the status of Rishus HaYochid. Therefore Reb Meir says that you can stand in the caramelis and lock and unlock the door. But the door itself, the lock itself, has the status of Reshus HaYochid, and therefore if the key is in the Karmelis, you cannot put it into the lock. And we've discussed this previously, this Reb Meir. It's actually a discussion in Hilchas Mezuzah. A door frame has to have a certain opening area, and what happens if the doorway is an arch? Then do we say that since I could potentially carve out the doorway and give it its correct dimensions, do we say that already now it's as if it's been carved out and it's chayav mezuzah or not? And Reb Meir says, choykekin lahashlim, and therefore it has the status of Reshus HaYochid. Rabbanon Sovra, the Chachomim say, ein choykekin lahashlim, there's no such thing as virtually speaking, as if to carve out, and we say no, you take it at face value. If at this point the lock is not 4x4 tefachim, then it's considered a mokim p'tur. If it's a mokim p'tur, I can carry the key from the Karmelis to the mokim p'tur. Omer of Bivi Barabaya, Rav Bivi Barabaya said the following: Shma mino miho masnita. From this whole brisa, I've learned three things, three halachas. Shma mino choykekin lahashlim. Number one, we learned that according to Reb Meir, choykekin lahashlim, that you can, virtually speaking, give something the status of Reshus HaYochid, even though it doesn't have those dimensions, because it could have those dimensions if you carved them out. Another thing he learned, Shma mino hodar be Reb Meir misharei gino. That even though in the first part of the brisa, Reb Meir said explicitly that if the key is in the lock, and the person is standing either in the Reshus HaRabim or in the Gino, which is the Karmelis, at the beginning of the brisa we saw clearly that Lo lekan v'lo lekan asurim kan v'kan. You're not allowed to stand in a Karmelis and lock or unlock a door where the key is in the Reshus HaYochid. And here in the second part of the brisa, Reb Meir changed his mind. Reb Meir said clearly that as providing the keys in the Reshus HaYochid, a person is allowed to stand on this askupa, on this Karmelis, on this threshold before the chanuyos, before the shops, and he's allowed to lock and unlock the door. So you see that Reb Meir, even though at the beginning of the brisa, he was afraid that you might take the key from the Reshus HaYochid to the Karmelis, in the second case of the brisa, we see that Reb Meir is not afraid of that. That was the second halacha. Or Shamus Mino, the third halacha is Midrabanon. We see from the opinion of the Rabbanon that Asyalid Rav Dimi, they hold of Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi Omer Rabbi Yechanan. He said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, Mokim she'ein bar bo al arba. If you have an area which is not 4x4 tvachim, muter lebnei Reshus HaRabim v'lebnei Reshus HaYochid lekasif olav ubilvad shelo yachlifoi. From the fact that the Rabbanon said, and let's remember, according to the Rabbanon, according to everybody, this lock is less than 4x4. According to Rabbanon, we don't say choykekin lahashlim. This lock, where we're actually opening and closing the door, is got the status of a Reshus HaYochid, of a mokim p'tur. A mokim p'tur. And the Rabbanon say you can stand on the threshold, even if the key is on the threshold, you can take the key and put it into the lock, because you're allowed to carry from a Karmelis to a mokim p'tur. But the Rabbanon said, the last statement in the brisa, that you cannot then take the key. You can take the key back to the Karmelis, but you cannot take it and put it onto a window which is 4x4 tvachim wide. The window on top of the door, at the end of the brisa, it said explicitly, also. And even though over here he's taking the key from the lock, which is a mokim p'tur, and he's putting it onto the window, which is a Reshus HaYochid. What's the problem? You're allowed to carry from a mokim p'tur to Reshus HaYochid. But you see from here that since initially, where did the key start? On the askupa, which was a Karmelis. And then you put it into the lock, which was a mokim p'tur. And then you want to take the key from the mokim p'tur and put it into Reshus HaYochid, and you're not allowed to do that. And this is proof that they hold of what Rabbi Yechanan said, that even though you're allowed to adjust your baggage, your loads, onto a mokim p'tur, that means you could be either in Reshus HaYochid or in Reshus HaRabim, and you can put down what you're wearing, what you're carrying onto this mokim p'tur, ubilvad shelo yachlifo. You're not allowed to transfer via the mokim p'tur from one domain to another. You cannot take your loads from Reshus HaRabim, put it onto mokim p'tur, that's no problem, and then take it from the mokim p'tur to Reshus HaYochid. Even though from mokim p'tur to Reshus HaYochid you would be allowed to do, but not if it originated in Reshus HaRabim, because people will get confused and they'll end up taking things directly from Reshus HaRabim to the Reshus HaYochid. So from the fact that the Chachamim said that you cannot take the key from the Karmelis, from the skupa, into the lock, mokim p'tura, and from the lock to the window, which is the shus hayachid, you see that the chachomim hold of this halacha. Continues the next Mishnah. Nagar, if you have a bolt, sheyesh b'roishay glustera, and there's a knob at the end of this bolt, and they would use this bolt in order to wedge a door open, to wedge a door closed. They would knock it into the ground in order to hold the door in place. The question is that since there's a knob on top of this bolt, and it looks pretty much like a kli, you can actually use it to pound, to crush something in a crucible. Then if you have this bolt, then Rabbi Eliezer says that you're not allowed to put this bolt into the ground to hold the door. It looks like you're building, because it looks like you're putting a peg into the floor, and that's boine. Rabbi Yossi Matir. Rabbi Yossi says that you are allowed to, since it's got the status, it looks like a kli, therefore it doesn't look like building, and you're allowed to put this wedge in this bolt into the floor to hold the door. Omer Rabbi Eliezer. Ma'aseh b'knesses. There was some say it's supposed to say Beis HaKnesses. There was an incident in a shul, Shebat Tveria in Tveria. Shayu noyagim by heter. They were accustomed to using such a bolt and using it on Shabbos. Ad shebor ben Gamliel v'azkenim, until Rabbi Gamliel and the elders came v'asru and said they're not allowed to do it anymore, which would seem that they then ruled like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yossi says the opposite way around. He says that Isur na'agubo. Rabbi Yossi says it's okay. He says that in that shul, they always were used to not using this bolt on Shabbos. And Rabbi Gamliel and the elders came and said they were allowed to use it. So Rabbi Eliezer had this incident, saw it one way. Rabbi Yossi understood it a different way, or they had a different tradition what the story was. And therefore, at the beginning of the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Oyser, Rabbi Yossi Matir. Continues the Gemara, says the Gemara, B'nitzel ba'oigdoi kule al maloi pligi. If this bolt is hanging on a cord, and you can actually lift up this bolt with the cord, that means the cord is strong enough to actually hold this bolt, then everybody agrees that it doesn't look like it's like he's putting a peg there, and he's putting he's putting this bolt there in order for it to stay there. It's not considered boine, and it's mutter. Ki pligi, when are they arguing? If it's attached to a cord to the frame, to the door, to the wall, but if you try to lift up this bolt with the thread will tear. It means even though it's sort of tied up, but it's not really suspended and not able to be held by this cord. Demar sovar, then the Rabbi Yossi holds, Kivan diyesh b'roishe glustera, since there's a knob at the end of it, Toiras kliolov, it has the status of a utensil, and then everybody can see that this is not called boine, and therefore you're allowed to use it. Umarasovar, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kivan de'enu nitel be'igdoi loi, since it cannot be held and taken with this cord, therefore it's as if it's not attached, and therefore you're not allowed to use this bolt to close the door on Shabbos. And more details of this we're going to see in the next Mishnah, in the next Shir, in Mirza Hashem.